Greetings, greetings, greetings. Oh, we're from all over. We are from Hawaii. We are from Walla Walla, Washington, Queens, New York, Rhode Island, Wisconsin, Hawaii again, Queens, New York, ATL. Thank you guys for joining us tonight as our last but not least workshop for the day. The song that was just playing, if you are curious, was Nina Simone, New World Coming. I am F.A. Osarin. I am the founder of Doula Chronicles. Doula Chronicles is a space blog and Instagram page hosting and holding information of doulas across the nation, of birth workers across the world, and sharing information as we get them. Doula Chronicles Reproductive Futurism is a virtual gathering in honor of our work and in honor of the work of Lorretta Ross and Octavia Butler have done to lead us in their footsteps on dreaming and creating anew of what a better future around pregnancy and birth can look like. As birth workers, we are on the front lines of this maternal health crisis, and we witness near misses, mistreatment from healthcare staff, and obstetric violence all the time. Grieving and mourning is a part of our work, and so is creating anew where it didn't exist before. Reproductive Futurism is a space to share with your comrades what the future can look like. And as said by one of our elder Black midwives, who we all love, Jenny Joseph, we are in the business of saving lives. I want to welcome Tyla Leach. Tyla Leach is a 23-year-old New York City native. She's an alumna from Rory Meyers College of Nursing, which she graduated from in May 2018 with a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing. Her focus is on helping expecting parents have a peaceful, positive, and powerful experience during pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. She utilizes mindfulness, affirmations, music, and positive touch to help create an environment conducive to relaxation. She's passionate about educating families in order to allow them to make informed decisions and be active participants in their own care. As a queer Black woman, her focus is working with low-income Black and Brown and or LGBTQ individuals to increase their access to birth services. She is currently a labor and delivery registered nurse and attending SUNY Downstate, where she is pursuing her master's in Nurse-Midwifery. She hopes to one day get her Ph.D. and is focusing on issues of LGBTQ inclusion in birth work and health practices. Thank you, Tyla, for joining us tonight. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here.
Great. If you have any comments as the presentation continues, just put them in the chat box. Any questions, put them in the Q&A box, and Tyla, I'll let you take it from here.
All right. So yeah, I love comments. I don't want this to be like a lecture because I get bored during lectures. So I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and then FA is going to read to me some of the responses in the chat as they come, because I'm going to share my screen and it's a lot to go back and forth and stuff. So yeah, let me do that now. All right. Can you guys see my screen okay? Yes. All right. Cool. So I kind of wanted to talk about this whole thing because I feel like when I entered the birth world, a lot of what I saw was talking about, you know, the issues of race and medical racism and the way that our medical system treats Black people. And then there was the issue of LGBTQ folks and how, you know, completely missing from the conversation. But then I always spent time looking for people that looked like me, you know, Black queer people, and that was very much so missing from the conversation. And so I think that it's important to not only have the conversation about race and not only have the conversation about, you know, the issues of inclusion of queer and trans bodies when it comes to birth and reproductive justice, but also what it's like to be not only dealing with, you know, the system trying to kill you because you're Black, but also the system acting like you don't exist because you're queer or trans or LGBTQ identified. So that is a little bit about why I want to talk about this. So let's just get right into it. So this number I put up because I think it's really important to break down percentages. I feel like a lot of times when we talk about population and stuff, it's very like X% of people identify as this. So 12% of LGBTQ people in the US identify as Black, right? But what does that look like in terms of people that we actually know and love? So if you break it down even further, there are 8 million, I have the number, but my phone locked, one sec. There are 8,700,000 people in the United States that identify as LGBTQ. So that's 8 million people that are part of this community. 12% of those, which is about 1,050,000, are Black. And so I think when you look at it like that, 12% can seem like a small number, but there are 1 million people in this world that can look at these images and look at media and look at the spaces that we create and feel like they don't see themselves. So I talk about media a lot because I am a millennial, I'm 23. And I think that, you know, we like to imagine that only my generation or the generation below me gets a lot of their ideas from the media. But when I had conversations with my mother and my older family members, and when I had my experience coming out and talking to them about my identity, they just had never encountered it before. You know, their idea was like that one gay person on the show that they watched. And so I think it's important to look at those numbers and see, one, not only what people outside of the community are seeing and where they're getting their perspective from, but also, you know, what am I seeing and what are LGBTQ people, especially Black, queer, and trans people, seeing when they look at the screen. I really love PowerPoint transitions, by the way, so I'm very excited about these. So this is according to a report by GLAAD called Where Are We in TV? And this just examines 2019 to 2020. So on broadcast television, of the 120 LGBTQ characters counted, only 28 of them are Black, which I think is better than I expected, but obviously still not great. And then when you break it down even further, on broadcast networks, there are 4 trans men, 2 trans women, and 1 non-binary character. 5 characters are series regulars and 2 are recurring. Then when you go to cable, of the 215 LGBTQ characters, 48 of them are Black, and there are 14 trans women, 4 trans men, and 2 characters who are non-binary. 11 of these characters are series regulars and 9 are recurring. And then streaming services, which I think I would expect to have the best representation, but surprisingly don't. Of 153 LGBTQ characters, only 19% are Black, and on streaming platforms, there are 5 trans women, 4 trans men, and 2 non-binary characters. So what I think is also important to note is that non-scripted programs aren't included, which I think is oftentimes where I look at my representation. So MTV had like the gay season of Are You the One, where everyone was LGBTQ, and then Bachelor, the Queer Eye, and stuff like that. So one of the questions I wanted to open up to everyone were, when you watch TV and you see these characters, 1, do you feel like you see these numbers represented in the things that you watch? And 2, do you feel like when you do see them, they're giving accurate representations, or if they're just giving stereotypes? Leave it in the chat. Someone said, I'm surprised at the number even that high. Stereotypes, 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 stereotypes. So I'm glad we all agree. I feel like the numbers are not that great because many folks are on the same show, and I definitely agree. I wanted to see more of it broken down by show because I think that you have shows that it's like everyone is gay, and that's kind of the show's appeal, is because they're trying to check off that diversity box. And then you have shows that have like the gay friend. And I definitely agree what percentage include a main character that identifies LGBTQ. I think if you're interested in this, this little, it's like you can find it on their website, is really interesting to look at because they actually do have page by page breakdowns of different subcategories. And they talk about, you know, main characters versus tropes. So I think that that's a really good document to look at. I feel like I don't see this as much in terms of representation, and I wish I would see it more. I definitely agree. I think 22% and 19% are like abysmal numbers, especially when you break it down into there are 5 trans women on a show out of 153, I think is absolutely absurd. So I'm going to keep going. See, I love transition. So one thing I often think that we are afraid to touch on is what are accepted identities in society and subsequently the birth world, especially when it comes to the subsets of LGBTQ culture. I think if you look at real life and look at the birth world, a lot of what you see comes in subsets. You see a lot of, you know, like here's a lesbian couple that has used like IUI or IVF, or like here's a gay couple that's used a surrogate or something like that. And, you know, you see those pictures on whether it be birth pages or on the news, and it's like, that is normal. That is, you know, become normal. It is more accepted. Whereas when you see trans bodies that are carrying pregnancy that aren't necessarily female identified, or you see couples that have a non-binary person that are not female identified that's carrying a pregnancy, or someone who's decided to have top surgery that's carrying a pregnancy, the response is completely different. You get a lot of, you know, transphobia, you get a lot of personally invasive questions, things that would totally not be accepted if we were talking about couples that fit into this idea of what people are accepted. But as much as we try to, you know, step outside of what is accepted and push those boundaries, even in the birth world, we kind of sort of fall back into those things. So in case anyone who's joining isn't aware of cisheteronormativity, cisheteronormativity is kind of the same idea that I was talking about, where what's considered normal is cis bodies, or bodies who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth, and also heterosexual couples. And so we're used to seeing the birth experiences of cis women. You look on the most popular birth sites and the birth Instagrams, birth socials, whatever, and the things that you're going to see most of the time are going to be cis women giving birth. And we're used to seeing the birth experiences of heterosexual couples. I mean, I can speak to my experience working as a nurse in New York. You kind of have to break out of the language, because as I was getting trained, as I'm working, everyone's like, where's husband? Does dad want to do this? Can dad come cut the cord? Is your husband coming? And that's the language that is normalized. It's never even a thought to some people. Or, mom, do you want to hold the baby? Hey, mom, how are you doing? Oh, you're going to be a mama. Are you excited? And no one even stops to think about the language that we're so used to using and how that can be exclusionary for an entire group of people. And so where does that leave our trans and non-binary patients and clients when their experience in their lives are the ultimate other, when they're left out of not only representation, but training and education? And that's something that I'm going to jump back to. So these are some, I did an interview a while back with a couple of the people in my life, and these are some of the thoughts that they had when it came to healthcare and their experiences as trans or non-binary individuals. So I'm going to read them, and then I'm going to ask you guys for your thoughts. So one person said, I think it can feel alienating for some non-binary and trans individuals, especially with the language surrounding reproduction. Even at NYU, they refer to it as the women's health department. I'm not a woman, so I don't feel like that's a place for me, you know? And then when I do go to a place like that, they assume I'm a woman because I'm there. So that just further reinforces the feelings that I don't belong there. I think this would be the first step to maybe coming around to the idea of having kids. For most of my life, I haven't thought about it, or I've outright rejected the idea because I have so many negative preconceptions about pregnancy. And then another person said, it is important to find a person willing to use the language I choose to describe my body. Providers need to be able to adjust to the fact that some of their patients may not be comfortable with having parts of their body described by terms that are considered to be traditional. Some trans masculine identified people and lots of others who don't identify in this way prefer different terms to be used to describe their reproductive and or sexual anatomy. And having your body referred to in a way that makes you feel disconnected from it or uncomfortable with it isn't going to be conducive to a good doctor-patient relationship. If providers want to truly make their patients feel supported, they have to be able to adapt the way they communicate. So what are people's thoughts on those two quotes? This has been something I've been trying to figure out. I like to say birthing person, birthing individual, but I'm struggling for great ways to transition that to postpartum. So a lot of times in postpartum, I think it's good to just say, you know, like birthing parent and support parent, you can say, or, you know, simple things, or just like person. I think a lot of times we like fixate on labels and like just say, how are the parents feeling today? Or like, how are the caregivers feeling today? Or, you know, like you guys are taking care of baby, y'all are taking care of baby. How do you feel like you need support? And I think a lot of the times also we realize that our language can then include the entire birthing village. So what I see a lot in postpartum at work is we say, how is mom feeling? And then the person who's there supporting them is completely left out of the conversation. Whereas if you walk into the room and you say, how are baby's parents feeling today? Or how is baby's support team feeling today? How is everyone feeling today? Just cut out the terms. Everyone then is a part of the conversation. Someone said, ask everyone what terms they used, learn not to assume, make that the default, definitely. Gestational parent, lactating parent, postpartum person. It's a lot of deprogramming the program, must happen through intention and practice. And I definitely agree with that. I think a lot of people can just think that like you have to have it down pat right away. And it is a constant learning process. As they were saying in the last session, we're all students, we're all continuously learning. So you're gonna have slip ups and you're gonna have mistake, and that's okay. Always mirror the language, which is helpful when you can figure out a general title or terms. I tend to address them as partners or birthing partners till I know their pronouns. What I'm running into is people who are angry that I'm not using mother and she and her. So I definitely understand that. Like I said, I work in Queens, and the neighborhood that I work in Queens isn't necessarily the type of area where the language like birthing person or birthing parent is really normalized. So I think that where you are is also going to have a big impact on the ease that you have integrating these terms into your daily language. Especially like, you know, you work in a place where there's 20 people and you're the only person saying that. And I'm using hospital because that's what I'm used to. You're the second or third nurse to walk into the room and you're the only person saying birthing person. They can kind of have that reaction of like, why are you saying that? But I think it's one of those things kind of like using partner. Like everyone is going to use the term that they want to use. And if you have a client where you see that using birthing person is upsetting them, you can shift your language, but that is always something you're going to have to be cognizant about. No two people are going to be the same. So you may have one client that like is really going to be against that for whatever reason, and you have to kind of learn how to adjust. And like I said, it's a constant learning process. Yes, little she, her pin, that's opened up a lot of good conversation. Definitely. I think that's a good way to integrate pronouns. And like people said, normalizing pronouns. If you just say, hey, my name is Tyla, my pronouns are she, her, I'm going to be taking care of you today, I'm going to be your doula, or in your little blurb, you know, or even you can put them in your Zoom name. And that's a good way to start to normalize it. Yes, pronouns should be included in the chart. And certain medical systems are starting to get with the program, but I also know that many people kind of just skip over it, which is unfortunate. So I think that it's important to note that transphobia is a direct product of white supremacy. I think that when we talk about birth and we talk about, you know, decolonizing our birth practice and working to fight against white supremacy and racism in the birth world, we have to remember that you cannot separate those things from combating transphobia. And I think that we have to not only understand that in ourselves, but be willing to push that on other people. I'm very big on calling people out for their transphobia. And I think that, you know, when you frame it that way and you start to have those conversations, it can open up the door to people realizing that like what you are so intent on holding on to is literally birthed out of colonialism. So history has shown that the existence of queerness and transness has been suppressed by colonialism and white supremacy. PBS actually has a map of gender diverse cultures, and on every continent in the world, there is a history of gender diverse identities that were upheld and respected in society up until white supremacy and colonialism has come into the picture. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'm gonna look in the chat real quick, see if anyone has any thoughts. Come on, facts. Yes, you know, we love facts, okay? And like I said, we cannot as a society and as a community say that we are gonna combat white supremacy in our practice and still hold on to one of the direct, you know, outcomes from, yeah, of course I can go back to the slide. Here, let me move the chat so that you can see. And if there's a way, this is the link. Oh, it comes over if I hover over it. Let's see. Okay, so pbs.org/independent lens/content/two-spirits map HTML. So take a quick picture of that link. And I thought it was really interesting because literally every single continent has a history of what you would consider a gender diverse culture. Social determinants of health. So this is for all my nurses, healthcare providers, people who had to go to a school that makes you memorize all of these for your tests. And it's also important to understand in your practice. So Black, queer, and trans youth are more likely to experience homelessness, poverty, sexual abuse, and STIs. And that is obviously a product of the impact that being both Black and queer and trans has on their daily living. You cannot separate the two. You cannot separate these outcomes from the fact that they are living in a world that, again, discriminates against them because they are Black and discriminates against them because they are queer and trans. They're more likely to have less access to quality healthcare and understanding providers. They're more likely to face bullying, harassment, and familial abuse. And so knowing all of that and understanding all of that, understanding both the impact of you know, not seeing yourself represented in the media, and also having to deal with these social determinants of health that make you more susceptible to poor quality healthcare, more susceptible to dealing with issues from your family, more susceptible to facing homelessness and poverty. I asked to midwives or other care providers that are in this realm, how do we incorporate the direct care of Black, queer, and trans patients into our practice and education programs? And I'm going to open the chat again to see what people have to say, some thoughts. And I separated these slides into midwives and doulas, but this really can be anyone who is in some sort of medicalized profession, whether it be midwives or nurses, CNA, anything where you're under the system. I feel like I'm constantly asking professors in nursing school right now to use gender inclusive language. Some of them get on board and some of them are just clueless. Yes, I definitely agree. I was in my, I guess what you can say, obstetric course in midwifery, in nursing school, the one semester we have. And I remember my professor saying, you know, oh, you need to ask them if they're having, who they're having sex with and like what their gender, what their partners are, if they're male or female. So then you can understand their health risk. And I raised my hand and I said, that's not the question that you're asking. And she was like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, asking that question, is it going to give you the answer that you want? Because if I'm having sex with a trans man, that's going to give you a completely different type of experience and type of lens to look at your health assessment than if I'm having sex with a cis man. And so you need to be specifically asking, you don't need to ask that. Ask, what type of sex are you having? Are you having vaginal sex? Are you having anal sex? Are you having penetrative sex at all? Are you, you know, those are the questions that you want to know, because that shapes your health assessment more so than what partners do you have. So yeah, I think it's the little things for sure. By centering them, because then the care will then be tailored for all. Exactly. Demand pronouns be included in the EMR, definitely. It's about demanding change. I just had a professor say that queer people are damned to hell, and now we are fighting tooth and nail. The actual education we're receiving is transphobic and racist. The books have to change. The teachers have to change, all of it. I agree. And I am, ask anyone from NYU, the biggest advocate for sending emails to your professor's bosses, because they can also be fired and they can also be punished. And you are paying for that education, and you have a right to have a professor that doesn't say those type of inflammatory things. So definitely sending you love, and I'm so sorry that your students and your classmates have to deal with that. Yes, always be the troublemaker. All right, let's see what I have on here. So gender affirming care, including HRT. So I recently did a talk with someone and they had no idea that midwives could even do this. So at least I know in New York, I'm not going to speak for all of the US because the laws are extremely confusing. But in New York, CNMs can actually be the person that provides someone with gender affirming care and HRT, and people don't know that, and it's actually not even included in our training. So when I graduate, I am going to have to go pay for an extra course or pay someone to teach me, because you want to also know what you're doing. Pay someone to teach me about prescribing and dosing and making sure that I can assess my patients the right way. But that's not at all even worked into what our formal education is. It's a course that you have to electively take, which is not the case for anything else that we are allowed to do. Acknowledgement of race, gender, and their intersections as an important aspect of care. I think that, at least in my nursication that I really received from NYU, they definitely had the one Black professor come in and teach us about race, and the one gay professor come in and teach us about LGBTQ identity, and then kind of left it at that. And we had those 2 lectures, and that was really it. Instead of actually integrating it into every part of your care, and always having a reminder that you are practicing in a system that is going to have all of these factors in it that always need to be acknowledged. So like we said, importance of language about body parts, lactation, and feeding. Not everyone feels like they're going to breastfeed. Some people want to chest feed, some people want to body feed, or even the breast is best fed, as long as your baby is fed. However you want to feed your baby, if feeding your baby a certain way gives you dysphoria, that's fine, because your baby is still going to be fed and healthy and loved, and that's what's important. Hold your staff, birth assistants, and community accountable. I wish I had underlined community, because I think it is super important. If you have a birth worker friend that is your friend, but they're a transphobe, why are you keeping them in your circle? A lot of it is like, oh, but we're all birth workers, but they're committing violence. What they're doing is committing violence. And if there was a birth worker who was a white supremacist or something like that, that conversation wouldn't be the same. So we have to push ourselves to really hold our community members accountable and say, I'm going to give you grace, and I'm going to, love you no matter what. And I'm going to love you through this, but also I'm going to have my boundaries. And if loving you no matter what means loving you when you're transphobic, I don't know if I can do all of that. And I'm going to push you to be better. Educate yourselves on assisted reproductive technology. Like I said, midwives can help people participate in IUI and ICI, and that shouldn't be an elective that I get to take one day. That should be something that is incorporated into the knowledge, because you are going to care for LGBTQ families who may not be able to reproduce in ways that are covered in a traditional education. And they should be able to access providers anywhere that know how to help them. And pushing your alma maters to include transgender healthcare in their curriculum. So I'm already sending Downstate a bunch of emails about how we're lacking, and how that shouldn't just be an article that maybe I can read for one of our courses, and how it should be integrated into our care. Let me open up the chat, see what people have to say. Yes, create that lactation class. And yes, it is true, CNMs cannot see patients with penises unless they are prescribing medication for like STI or something like that, that they can then give. So that they receive from a partner that they had, then they can. But if you are dealing with a patient who's a trans man who wants to be on HRT, or anyone who is born with a vagina who wants to be on testosterone, you can actually prescribe that to them.
Tyla, do you want me to read off the Q&A questions during your presentation or at the end?
You can read some off now. That's fine.
In regards to the quotes, this is very insightful. Oh, it just disappeared. Oh no, I thought it disappeared. I'm also trying to balance between what is expected for those not familiar with LGBTQIA+ language and when it's appropriate to ask questions. And when is it appropriate to ask questions?
So I think it depends on your environment. You know, not everyone is going to be familiar. Like I said, my mother is still asking me questions to this day. But I think, one, know who you're talking to, because like if I don't know you like that, I don't want you coming up to me and being like, so what do you do when you have sex? Like that is like inappropriate, you know? And like as much as you would think that that is common knowledge, people don't have that foresight, and people think that like, oh, you're openly queer, like let me just ask you anything, which is like not how that works. But you need to, one, create spaces where you feel like you have people you can trust, and people that you can have those conversations with, and also not treating it as an other. I think it's one of those things where if you normalize it, it's not necessarily like you don't have to tiptoe around it. It's just like, oh yeah, this is what it is. This is the language that we use. And you know, you always can educate. You always have that time to be like, oh, you know, you actually can say this. It's like more inclusive, and just say it like, you know, it's nothing. I think that sometimes, especially when you're working with people who genuinely are trying not to do harm and just genuinely don't know, having a simple conversation, you know, I saw someone at work said something crazy, and I just like, they saw my face and I was like, yeah, that's not really a way that we should talk about that. And I kind of just left it at that. And afterwards, they had their own conversation with themselves and were like, you know, I didn't even realize that that could be super offensive and super harmful. And like, thank you for like calling me out on that. And it was that simple. And they haven't said anything wild again. So I guess it worked.
The next one is, how would putting pronouns in the chart help with understanding the dynamics of the patient? I'm not saying we should not. I'm just wondering if there is some other information that should be included so that there's a better connection to how we should interact.
I definitely agree. I think pronouns are definitely not the end all be all. Certain practices I think are more comfortable than others. Like I know some of the places that I go, they not only ask your pronouns, but how do you identify? What do you want to be referred to as? And I think those are some questions that can help open the door. But I also think you run into the issue of, if you have a staff that doesn't know what it means to take care of someone who is trans or someone who is non-binary, putting that in the chart isn't going to do anything, because they're going to see that and then they're going to have their preconceptions, and they're going to see and they're already going to walk into the room like bumbling and awkward and not really knowing how to act. So I think it definitely goes beyond further than that, and making sure that like, you know, you can't just do a training and think that your staff is going to be competent. Like we have to do a whole upending of the system, because then you won't have the issue of having care providers that don't know what that means. If from the moment you enter nursing school, you're having that experience, or the moment you enter into whatever training you have to do to be in an interaction with someone, that is normalized and that is part of the conversation. You don't ever have that moment of being uneducated or bumbling or not knowing how to interact with a patient, because it's always been a part of your training to enter into patient care or person care, whether you're a birth worker or someone in the medical field, even incorporating it into your doula trainings outside of a 5-minute segment. Which leads into this next slide. Birth workers, how do we provide informed care to Black, queer, and trans clients? How do we center their experiences in our support? Yes, I loved head on over to the Google before you ask personal questions. Yes, I definitely agree. So I'm gonna say what I have, and then I'll open it up to everyone else. So understand the additional stress of being queer and trans in the medical industrial complex. Like, again, I feel like the birth world is like trying really hard to catch up and like not be racist, but it's not doing a good job of multitasking. Like, okay, yes, sure, get rid of the white supremacy in one way, but also understand what it's like to be an LGBTQ person and walk into the space of a hospital, and or especially being like visibly not presenting the way that people think that you're supposed to present when you're pregnant. Like, the additional stress that adds on the body, and the way that stress will then impact your pregnancy and your health, and the way that stress will literally cause your health to deteriorate. That is something that has to be understood before you can even think about taking on someone who identifies as LGBTQ into your care, because if you can't understand that, you're not going to be able to really help them in the way that they need to be supported. Include gender diverse language in your materials and programming. Nothing gets me hot more than something that has a 5-minute segment on LGBTQ patients or clients, and then throughout the rest of the training, it's mamas and boobs and like, just all super gendered language. It's like your 5 minutes does not then negate the energy that you've had for the rest of this programming. If I'm in the space and the whole time I don't feel like you're talking to me, and then you show me one slide, that's not sufficient. You have to integrate that throughout everything that you do. Incorporate queer and trans identity into your considerations for sliding scale pricing. I strongly believe that sliding scale pricing, especially for Black folks, especially for LGBTQ folks, is very important, because like my Black ass is going through a lot, especially being Black and being queer. Like, it completely changes the experience. We know what it's like. We know that the increased rates of poverty, we know the increased stress. So like, if you can afford to, and if you can afford to give that option to people, then I think that you should. Amplify, pay, and take trainings led by Black, queer, and trans birth workers. Again, a lot of the biggest support you see is rallied behind white women who run these birth accounts and have hundreds of thousands of followers, and they post white bodies, and that's all you see. Especially, I was just talking about this the other day, like, the social media algorithm is not working with you if you are a smaller business or a smaller account. So like, don't just like, or like, oh, secretly message those people in your life. Actively amplify them, actively pay them, actively take their trainings. Even if it's a training you don't need to take, sign up and don't even show up. Like, just give them the support that they're not going to get from anyone else. Let's see. I want to pull the chat back up and see. Yes, gets me very spicy. We are not an extracurricular. I definitely agree. Nothing bothers me more than that. Like, my experience is not your bullet point on your slideshow, so that you can feel that you've checked all your boxes. The commodification and consumption of trans bodies on social media. This gets me even hotter than what I was talking about before. Sharing the bodies and birth experiences of trans birthing people on social media without considering the consequences of putting othered identities on display. Who is this for? Is it truly to center and honor and amplify the experience of the trans person, or is it to appease yourself as a vector for representation? You do nothing, absolutely nothing, by reposting or sharing that picture of someone who doesn't identify as female with their pregnant body or with their baby, if you let then the people in your life and your comments and the things like that say horrible things about them. And I have seen that so often, especially in the birth world. There are definitely a few people who are like, if you say something wild, you will be blocked, like, period. But to people who are like, oh, everyone here is allowed to like share their opinion. No, you don't get to put a body on display and then subject it to violence, because that's what you're doing. And so I think that that is something that people should be super cognizant about, because if you don't have the energy to engage, that's fine, but then don't share, because you're not being helpful. You're really contributing to their harm. You're opening up them to another platform to be harmed. You're literally putting their body out there and saying, please do as much harm as you want, and you will face no consequences. And that isn't doing anything for anyone. So the question I think that you have to ask yourself is, are you willing to call out and confront the inevitable transphobia that will arise from community, including from close friends and allies? I don't care if that's your best friend from middle school or whatever. Are you willing to have those conversations and say, this will not be allowed in this space? Because if you aren't, then maybe don't repost that photo or don't repost that video, or have the conversation with yourself as to why you aren't willing to do that. And so the big question that I want people to answer in the chat, if you can, what does a future look like where Black, queer, and trans people are centered, are loved, are honored, and are valued? I'm going to open up the chat and see what people have to say. Less deaths, yes, definitely. Literally will save lives. As many Black midwives as there are bodegas. Yes, we definitely need more Black midwives. Support all the Black midwives that you know. Donate to them, amplify them, send them love, all of that. More births outside of hospitals, yes. Assistive reproductive technologies are affordable and readily accessible. The amount of times people have had to create GoFundMes just to be able to carry children in a world where if you are not cis and you want to have a child, it's going to cost you $8,000 is absurd. Focus on our joy, rest, and care, not as entertainment or educators. Yes, people are not. You're free. Google. Use Google. Google is free. Healthy representation in medical content. Yes, yes. Even in midwifery school, they often talk about how they try and find images for us to learn off of and like study materials, and they're all cis male bodies. Not even difficult to find cis women bodies in medical content, let alone bodies that do not necessarily fit into the binary. Black male allyship, yes. More extensive and accessible network of birthing education for birthing people, as well as starting midwives. I agree. It is incredibly hard to find learning materials, specifically about the LGBTQ community, strong communities full of support. More QT, well, I'm just going to read it. Queer, trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary, plus doulas and midwives, especially intersex and assigned male at birth. I definitely agree. Wraparound care for queer families that continues far into postpartum and parenthood. White spaces, missing faces outlines how white feminism is killing Black bodies. Definitely go pick that up, and it looks more safe for everyone. I agree. And so my last slide, I did little curtains for the transition because I wanted to give it a big intro. Just says to support Black queer folks and support Black trans folks and combat transphobia in all birthing spaces. Emphasize and underline for all of those. One more thing says expanding full spectrum doula work into supporting and caring gender affirmation surgeries and hormone support. Yes, because people do not understand that experience. Like I just had a minor surgery and I like need someone to wait on me hand and foot. So like going through going through top surgery or bottom surgery is an extensive experience with an extensive recovery. And if you don't have a strong support system, like it can be very difficult. So definitely expanding doula work into that is also really important. Post-surgery should be considered as important as postpartum. I agree. Any suggestions on how we can replace the word maternity? Honestly, I haven't even like begun to battle that because it's everywhere, like maternity ward and stuff like that. I mean, just parenthood, like you're a parent. I feel like it's all like maternal, like you're a parent. And again, whatever people feel most comfortable with. If you are comfortable with the term maternity, that's fine. But if not, say like, hey, you're entering into parenthood, or we're dealing with, things like that. Perinatal health, yes. My business is called Perinatal NYC because I just think that perinatal is easier. Like there's no all-encompassing word I think that works as best as perinatal outside of, maternal health. It looks expansive, ways that I haven't even considered yet because queerness is so expansive. Exactly. Solutions to problems that we haven't even considered because we haven't expanded enough. Yeah, perinatal is a great word.
The only thing with perinatal, it's the definition is for immediately before and after birth.
Right. So then it doesn't even, you're missing that whole postpartum or non. And I think it just goes to show the way that people are forgotten in terms of language. Like the fact that the language that we have is only so expansive because people's experiences weren't even considered. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
So you have some questions.
Yeah. Oh, I guess
So,
my screen's staring off.
No, you can keep your screen on if you want, or you wanted to, however you want. This is your workshop. So how would you phrase talking to a midwife who says lifestyle or uses the wrong pronoun for a partner that is non-binary? And changing birth providers isn't an option. This is the best quote unquote person that the couple could find. FYI, they travel over 3 hours to see this person. Any tips? Thank you.
I think that's definitely a difficult position, and it kind of speaks to the issue of access. I think it honestly depends on what that person or what that family can handle. Because again, that's kind of just subjecting yourself to constant violence. And I think that having a very serious conversation, a very serious, kind of pros and cons of like, okay, this is going to be the best care we can receive in terms of outside of the hospital, outside of this location. But how is that language going to impact the experience of bringing life into this world and becoming a family if you were constantly feeling as though you're not valid? And I think that unfortunately I can't give the answer because I think that's a conversation they have to have with themselves. That is definitely a very difficult situation to be in, and I'm sorry that they have to deal with that. That sucks.
Where can we find more information on how to properly refer to body parts of an LGBTQIA+ person?
I don't really think there's a good online resource, or at least not that I know of. I think a good way to enter into anything is how do you like to refer to your body parts? Just ask. If you're already in that space where like that is going to be a topic of conversation, I think if you don't know somebody well enough, you shouldn't really be talking about their body parts anyways. But if you're already in that space where that is going to be a topic that needs to be addressed, you should just ask them because people know what they want to be called.
And last question is thoughts on how we support Black queer folk experiencing perinatal mood concerns in a specific nuanced way, or any more thoughts about Black queer birth plus mental health intersecting?
Yes, I think it's definitely important to understand all of the factors that can be impacting that situation. I mean, I think obviously it's going to vary person by person. But it is definitely going to be a confounding, factor. Not only are you dealing with the hormonal changes and the life changes of being a parent, but also existing in this world as Black and queer. I think figuring out where they need support the most, whether it's, my family doesn't support me, I need to have someone to talk to, and I don't have anyone to talk to, I'm worried about my child, finding out what is concerning them and pointing them in the right direction. I was lucky enough to go through, I think there was a Black therapist listserv or something like that, and found an amazing Black queer therapist. And I think that you just have to do that work of looking. I mean, unfortunately, it's going to be much more difficult, but there are resources and there is community, especially for people who are parents. There's definitely expansive community, and I have organizations that I know about that I would be happy to share. Happy to plug them now if people want me to. I don't know if people want me to, but I'm happy to share the ones that I do know. If that's something people want. Yes, please. Yeah, so one organization that my partner is a part of is called Collage. They're usually based out of Provincetown, but they're entirely focused on children with LGBTQ parents, and they do Family Week every year, where the children come and the families come to Provincetown and they take all the kids and they do different workshops about, you know, race, gender, sexuality, music, reading, like everything you can think of. This year, obviously, they were virtual, but if you are able to travel to Provincetown, it's awesome. And they do scholarships for certain families if they can't. Say lifestyle and you're catching these hands. Yes. Yes, lifestyle is definitely a language often used by religious people preparing to enter a space and cross a boundary. Exactly. Oh, you're welcome. Yes, you're welcome, everyone. I hope you guys enjoy. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Tyla. This was so informative, even for me, as someone who is in the community and works with the community. I'm learning as much as I'm learning well. I want to.
Where did your journey take you next, Tyla? I'm in midwifery school, currently at SUNY Downstate. You can find my GoFundMe in my bio because the girl is struggling.
Yes, support the student midwives.
But yeah, hopefully we'll be a midwife in a year and a half. I can push through this year and a half. And CNM. And yeah, one day maybe PhD, who knows? We'll see.
You know that doctorate is always bugging there. And everyone who's in a doctorate program says, don't do it. But I'm also just like, you're there though.
Exactly. Everyone I know who is in a doctorate program says that it's horrible, but I'm always like, but why are you still there? And they're like, well, you know, yeah. I'm like, so.
Yeah, considering some Black doctorate midwives would be nice.
Exactly. There's not enough of us. So we gotta kick open the door.
Well, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you again, Tyla. Everyone else, have a great night, and I will see you all tomorrow.
See you all tomorrow. I will be there.